Women, what happened when you gave the guy who's been single his whole life a chance? Story 1. I dated a guy who used me as a stand-in for the woman he really loved. The quiet guy in our friend group was 28 and had never dated anyone, so when he nervously asked me out after our usual weekend brunch, I figured why not give him a shot? His best friend since middle school was practically vibrating with excitement behind him, mouthing, "Please say yes," while he stumbled through his invitation. Our first date started sweet enough. He showed up with a single white rose and opened every car door, but something felt rehearsed about it all. When I mentioned loving hiking, he nodded seriously and immediately started typing on his phone under the table. I assumed it was nerves and let it slide. Date 2 was my birthday week, and he surprised me with this gorgeous vintage scarf, bold turquoise and coral patterns, really eye-catching stuff. I thanked him, but honestly, bright prints aren't my style at all. Later that week at a group hangout, his best friend couldn't stop gushing over it, mentioning how she'd been stalking a similar one online for months. That's when I started paying closer attention. The third date sealed it for me. We walked into this trendy coffee place I'd never been to, and before I could even look at the menu, he confidently told the barista, "She'll have the lavender honey latte with oat milk, extra foam." I hate floral drinks. They taste like soap to me. When I tried to protest, he looked genuinely confused and said his friend had mentioned I'd love trying new flavours. Then his phone buzzed. He read the message, and his face relaxed like he'd gotten reassurance. The ultra-specific latte order feels less like attentiveness, and more like he's reading from someone else's cheat sheet. I decided to test something. At our next group dinner, I made sure to sit where I could watch both of them. When I started complaining about my landlord trying to raise my rent illegally, he gave polite nods and "that sucks" responses. But the moment his best friend mentioned her car making weird noises, he completely transformed. He leaned forward, asked detailed questions about the sound, offered to look at it immediately, even suggested she could borrow his car anytime. The contrast was jarring. A few days later, I asked him to meet me for coffee. Regular coffee this time. I started gently, saying I didn't think we had the right chemistry. He actually looked relieved and admitted he'd been feeling anxious because he wasn't experiencing the butterflies everyone talks about. Then I decided to be direct. "Wait, she's been dating 2 people this whole time without knowing it. Can I ask you something? Why did you order her favourite coffee for me and buy me a scarf that's totally her style?" He went pale. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you light up around her in a way I never saw on any of our dates. You remember every detail about her life, but you needed coaching to talk to me. It feels like you've been dating her through me." She's being so gentle, but maybe he's finally getting it. I can imagine the realization hitting him. He stared at his hands for a long time before quietly admitting he'd been texting her during our dates for advice because he was terrified of messing up. Then he whispered that he couldn't imagine life without her, but was convinced she only saw him as a friend. "Have you ever actually asked her?" I said. 6 months later, she called me, practically squealing. Turns out after our conversation, he'd finally worked up the courage to tell her how he felt. She'd been giving him dating advice while secretly dying inside, watching him try to fall for someone else. They'd been tiptoeing around their feelings for years. That squeal is pure relief, finally catching up to what everyone else could see coming. They got married last spring, and honestly, watching them together at the wedding made everything click into place. The way they finished each other's sentences, how naturally they moved around each other. It was obvious they'd been a couple in everything but name for years. So giving the guy who'd been single his whole life a chance? Technically, it didn't work out for me, but I accidentally helped 2 people stop being idiots and realize they were already in love. I'll take successful matchmaker over awkward ex-girlfriend any day. Sometimes being the wrong person for someone is exactly the right thing to do. Story 2. I found out the real reason my perfect boyfriend had never had a girlfriend. He was 28 with a good job and admitted on our second date that he'd never had a real girlfriend. The next morning I found coffee waiting on my porch because I'd mentioned my machine was broken. Sweet, thoughtful, a little awkward. Those first 3 months were honestly great. There was one moment that stuck with me though. We were playing mini-golf and I was winning by a lot, teasing him about it. He got quiet and mumbled something about how at least he was good at things that actually mattered. I figured everyone gets competitive sometimes. That little dig about things that actually mattered isn't competitive banter. That's a warning flare. When he said it was time to meet his longtime friend group, I was excited. He'd mentioned they called him quiet mode until he had a few drinks and became party mode. I thought that just meant he loosened up around them. Game night started fine, but once the drinks kicked in, he became this different person, louder, more aggressive. When I was telling everyone about landing a big project at work, he interrupted to wave it off as some small thing I was working on. A couple of his friends shifted uncomfortably. On the drive home, I told him that hurt my feelings. He said I was being too sensitive and turned up the radio. "You're being too sensitive" is just code for, I get to be rude without consequences. After that, group hangouts became this weird performance. He'd cut me off mid-sentence, roll his eyes when I shared opinions, make little comments about me running our relationship. One of his buddies pulled me aside at a bar and quietly asked if everything was okay. I laughed it off but went home with this knot in my stomach. The breaking point was at someone's birthday party. He was on his third beer, holding court with everyone. From across the room, he called out loud enough for everyone to hear, telling me to stop chatting and grab him another drink. The conversation just died. Ordering your girlfriend around like she's your personal bartender in front of everyone? The audacity is breathtaking. I walked over, looked him in the eye, and said no. Then I told him quietly that I wasn't interested in being his prop. I grabbed my purse and left while the room sat in complete silence. My phone started buzzing before I even got to my car. First angry texts about how I'd embarrassed him in front of his friends, then desperate apologies. I blocked his number that same night. Going from rage text to apologies in minutes? The whiplash is real and she's smart to pull the plug. A few weeks later, I ran into one of his friends at the grocery store. He awkwardly apologised for not speaking up that night and mentioned that their group was weird now. Some people still hung out with my ex, others avoided the drama entirely. He said my ex kept insisting I couldn't take a joke, but nobody really seemed to buy it. I never heard from my ex again directly, though mutual acquaintances mentioned he'd become pretty isolated from that friend group. 6 months later, I started dating someone new who treats me with respect whether we're alone or with his friends. Looking back, I finally understood why he'd made it to 28 without anyone sticking around long enough to become serious. Respectful partner secured, toxic solo campaign unlocked, balance restored. Story 3. I discovered my boyfriend was paying a coach to date me. I gave a 29-year-old guy a chance when he told me he'd never had a serious girlfriend. He was this quiet civil engineer who seemed genuinely sweet, just shy. On our second date, he admitted he'd been single his whole life because work kept him busy, and he was pretty introverted. Honestly, it was refreshing after dating guys with messy ex-drama. The first few months were incredible. He'd remember random things I mentioned and plan these thoughtful dates around them. Like I'd mention missing this specific peppermint tea my mum used to buy, and he'd show up with a box of it the next week. My friends kept joking that he was too good to be true. But then I started noticing weird little things. Sometimes his texts would sound really formal, like customer service responses. He'd have these moments where he'd pause just a beat too long before responding to something I said, like he was thinking really hard about his answer. Once he sent me this motivational text that started with, "Sarah, remember you are capable of achieving." And when I asked why he used my full name like that, he said his phone auto-corrected weird and laughed it off. The formal texting thing is giving me the creeps. Like, who talks like that? The whole thing unravelled on a random Tuesday night at his place. He went to make us smoothies and I grabbed his laptop to pull up this movie trailer I wanted to show him. When I opened it, there was still an email up that he must have just finished reading. The subject line was, Week 8 Progress Report. Target, Sarah. I felt my stomach drop. The email was from something called Relationship Success Coaching, and it was talking about our last date like it was a business transaction. It had bullet points about conversation goals and mentioned using affirmation script C when I talked about work stress. There were attachments with titles like date planning templates and text message examples. Target, Sarah? I'm literally a target in someone's email and I hate everything about this. When he came back with the smoothies, I just turned the laptop screen toward him. He went completely white and tried to close it, saying it was just some weird spam or something. But I'd already seen my name all over those emails. I told him I knew what it was and asked him to just be honest with me. He broke down pretty much immediately. Turns out he'd been paying this relationship coach hundreds of dollars a month for what was basically a step-by-step guide to dating me. They'd have him report back after each date, and then they'd send him scripts for texts and conversation topics for the next one. He said he'd been terrified that the real him would bore me, so he thought this was the only way to keep me interested. His confession hits different when you realise none of those sweet moments were actually him. The worst part was that he genuinely seemed to care about me. He kept saying his feelings were real, just that he didn't trust himself to express them the right way. He'd been planning to gradually stop using the coaching once things got more serious, but he was scared to risk it. I told him I couldn't be in a relationship where I didn't know if I was talking to him or some script. We talked for hours that night, both of us crying, but I ended up going home single. It was one of the saddest breakups I've ever had because I could tell he was a good person, just really insecure. About a year later, I heard through mutual friends that he'd started seeing a therapist and was dating someone new. This time he was being completely upfront about his inexperience from day one. I was genuinely happy to hear that. We both deserved something real. It's weirdly heartwarming that he figured it out. Sounds like they both got the real thing this time. Story 4. My fiancé cancelled our wedding because he never had a wild phase. I did. We worked in the same department when I was 29 and he'd just turned 30. On paper, he was the office unicorn, sharp, promoted fast, polite to everyone, but also the guy who ate plain yogurt for lunch every single day and never joined happy hour. During a late shift, I asked why he'd never dated seriously, and he said grad school turned into long hours, then one year just blurred into the next. He sounded more embarrassed than proud about it, so I believed him. The first 8 months really were great. He mispronounced my last name for a month, and once brought me a soy latte even though I'm allergic, but he doubled back in the rain to replace it. The moment that hooked me was when I landed from a red-eye looking like a zombie, and he was at Arrivals holding the exact triple shot drink I used to stay awake. Nobody had ever done that before. After almost 2 years, he proposed on a quiet hiking trail. The ring wasn't huge, but it was set with my late grandmother's birthstone because I'd mentioned it once. Wedding planning started smoothly. He had spreadsheets for everything, and our families got along great. Honestly, I thought I'd hit the jackpot with the one genuinely good guy who just hadn't been snatched up yet. Then his older brother's marriage fell apart, and the brother crashed on our couch for a week. He spent every night ranting about lawyers and how being tied down at 35 ruined his prime years. After he left, my fiancé got quiet, started making weird comments about wedding costs, asking if we really needed a DJ or if the venue was too expensive. At our engagement party, a friend joked about his last night of freedom, and I watched this frozen smile stay on his face way too long. That frozen smile hit different, like watching someone's brain completely glitch out. The real warning bell was at our cake tasting. We'd paid a non-refundable deposit, and out of nowhere he asked the baker what happened if life circumstances changed. I laughed it off, but my stomach dropped. That night he asked if my ex and I ever had an open relationship. I thought he was kidding, but he wasn't. More questions followed. How many people I'd dated? Did I ever wish I'd played the field more? Was I sure settling down this young wasn't limiting? 3 months before the wedding, he started working late almost every night. When I finally cornered him for a real conversation, he broke down. Turns out he'd been having panic attacks, but not the kind you'd think. I came home early one day and found him just sitting on the floor in the dark, scrolling through Instagram stories of single guys travelling and partying. He had this dead look in his eyes. Doom scrolling other people's highlight reels while your own life is on pause, that's brutal. He admitted he was terrified he'd lived too safely. No casual hookups, no reckless stories, and this felt like his last chance to experience that stuff. He suggested we postpone the wedding so he could explore for a bit and come back with no regrets. I told him I wasn't a trial run for adulthood. The next few weeks were brutal. One day he'd beg me not to leave. The next he'd wonder aloud if single people were happier. My parents had already mailed invitations, my dress was paid for, and vendors needed final head counts. After another circular conversation where he flip-flopped 3 times in an hour, I slid the ring across the table and said I loved him, but loved myself more. Handing back that ring was like closing the tab on a browser that never stopped refreshing. Finally, some peace. Cancelling everything was its own nightmare. Vendor fees, awkward calls to relatives, my mum crying over wasted deposits. I lost about $6,000, but the relief was instant once the last payment was refunded. I used some of the leftover savings to book a solo trip and remembered what calm felt like. 6 months later, I bumped into him at a crowded bar. He was chatting up 2 different women who'd clearly arrived separately, and he kept glancing between them like he was managing a complicated juggling act. When he saw me, he gave this guilty little wave and immediately turned back to the blonde. Guy looked busy, I'll give him that. So giving the forever single guy a chance? For me, it ended before the altar. Seeing him at that bar, it just clicked. It wasn't that he couldn't find someone, it was that he couldn't handle the thought of choosing someone and closing all his other doors. That was scarier to him than being alone. Seeing him juggling 2 women at once? Yeah, that tracks. Guy was never scared of being alone. He was scared of missing out. Story 5. I found out I wasn't his girlfriend. I was his rehab. I met him when I was 29 and he was 32. Over coffee he blushed and admitted he'd never had a real girlfriend. I figured he was just shy. For 3 months it was honeymoon stuff. Flowers, surprise lunches, the whole rom-com starter kit. The first odd moment came during a playoff game. My Wi-Fi hiccuped and he panicked, jabbing his phone like it owed him money. He laughed it off, said he had a tiny wager. A week later he asked to borrow $100 because his paycheck was hung up. He paid me back 2 days later, so I let it slide. Then I met his family. Sunday roast, normal chatter, until the compliments piled up. His mum hugged me like I'd just saved a puppy. An aunt whispered, "You have no idea how good you are for him." It felt less like a welcome and more like a thank you card. Over the next visits, the comments got weirder. A cousin quietly asked, "Has he phoned you at 3 a.m. yet?" I said no. She exhaled like I'd given her lab results. That cousin's midnight call question felt less like small talk and more like a fire drill checklist. Yikes. The curtain finally dropped at a summer barbecue. He was outside manning the grill. I ducked into the mudroom to wash my hands. I heard his mum on the phone, voice low and shaky. I can't cover anymore. He swears he's done. She keeps him busy, thank God. I'm just hoping it sticks. My stomach flipped. I walked straight outside, pulled him behind the garage and asked, "How much do you owe and who else is paying for it?" That whispered confession from Mum. It's the sound of a slot machine hitting zero and my jaw just swung open. He froze, tried to shrug it off, saw my face, and cracked. Years of sports bets, almost 25 grand in debt, parents bailing him out. When he started seeing me, they pushed him to focus on something healthy. Translation: hand the babysitting to me. I was furious, at him for lying, at them for recruiting me, and at myself for ignoring the signs. I told him I cared about him, but I wasn't a rehab centre, then drove home before I said something I'd regret. Choosing self-respect over damage control is a power move I can practically feel in my bones. He rang my phone all night. The next morning I dropped his stuff at his place and ended it on the porch. He cried, promised meetings, swore it'd be different. I wished him luck and left. A year later, a mutual friend said he'd been evicted, moved back in with his parents, and finally checked into treatment. I genuinely hope it sticks. So giving the guy who'd just never found the right person a chance? Turns out he wasn't a hidden gem. He was hiding a problem big enough to keep everyone else away. Rom-com starter kit returned to sender. Sometimes the missing exes were actually waving red flags the whole time. Glad she bailed early. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out this video next.